Hello? Hello? All right, let's get started. People are still wandering in, but lunch is over. These guys are telling me they're going to be really hardcore about the 75 minutes with questions, so let's get going. Because every time I've talked about this stuff before, there's been a lot of questions, and I anticipate there will continue to be a lot of questions, so want to make sure we have enough time for those. My name is Mike Harsh. I'm a program manager on the Silverlight team. I've been working on Silverlight for 3.5 years now, pretty much since before it was WPFE. How's that sound? We used to call it Shazaml. I know. And you thought WPFE was bad, right? So basically, if you guys have been to any of my talks at MIX before, I like to show a lot of really gratuitous graphics and video-based demos. And well, first off, Joe showed a lot of that stuff in his talk before, so he kind of took a lot of the zing out of it. And the other thing is, with offline, as exciting as this feature is, and as exciting as the things it enables for Silverlight, because frankly, I think it's really, really powerful, the actual mechanics of it is kind of like writing an installer, or a lot of things like an installer. So some of that stuff is kind of not quite as exciting. So I had to figure some way to make it a little splashier. So my solution was just basically do what the Adobe guys have been doing for a long time and do my whole presentation in Silverlight. So this right here is not PowerPoint, although it might look like PowerPoint. It's actually a Silverlight application. And so I'm using the new perspective 3D stuff to rotate it. This app is actually, it's not just for giving a presentation, it's also for creating these slides. So that it's very similar to something that might ship in the Office suite if you guys want to play with that. It's on my blog right now. And this actual particular thing, these are just XAML files is what the presentations are. That's up there as well. So you'll see this app a little more throughout the thing, but that's the best I could do because offline is just installing stuff. Anyways, so let's start out with a recap of what you guys saw today in the keynote and from the KEXP app as well as the things that Scott talked about. So with the KEXP app, you saw the installation experience. You saw one flavor of the installation experience, which was the Mini's little Silverlight install button on someplace on the web page, and that launched basically the dialog that says where do you want your shortcut to go, and then you click OK to that, and it runs the app. So in that mode, you basically have you're showing it's kind of a click to install experience. You can also do we kind of call it try before you buy, but try before you buy isn't super great because people think there's money involved, and it's just running the app before it's taken out of the browser. So there's the two models we enable. In both models, what you have is the exact same Zap, the exact same application running inside and outside of the browser. And you can change the look of your UI based on some properties on the application that you can check. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. But the model that the KEXP guys went for is let's have an install button, which is just a Silverlight island that basically is the same application that triggers that offline installation experience. So again, it's all about that consumer-friendly experience. What you saw there this morning was really simple. You click a button, you get asked where you want shortcuts, you click OK, and it goes. There's nothing scary. There's no security prompts. The reason there's no security prompts goes to that second bullet there. It's all about the sandbox. The things you can do in Silverlight out of browser are the same things you can do in Silverlight in the browser. It's really the same model. And the reason you can get such a great web-like deployment model and web-like update model is because you're still living in the sandbox. That's why the web model is great, is because you can push updates to a server once. The next time you hit the site, you get the new version. So we've tried to clone that pretty similarly. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. Also, as Scott mentioned, we've got built-in auto-updating support. So we try to keep the defaults really simple, but basically you run your app, we'll look for updates. Again, I'll talk more about that. And we've also added some network connectivity APIs, so you can see if you can build an application that's fully connected, occasionally connected, or completely offline by sniffing network. And again, there's some integration with various shell parts of both the Mac and Windows operating systems we run on. So let's start off with a quick UX walkthrough again, just to kind of refresh what you saw this morning and get you guys familiar again with the UX. You'll see it a lot in the next hour, but we'll start off here. So let's minimize my app here. So what we've got is a sample application. I'm going to show run the app and then take the exact same app offline experience versus the click to install experience here. So this is that slideshow creation app I showed you. This is what I built my slides in. So you can type here, you can do some bulleting, whatnot, change some functionality, and you can create a bunch of new slides. And so this is, moderately interesting app. It uses the open and save dialogues to save your slideshow to your local machine and whatnot. But it has this new trick in Silverlight 3, this install on the local computer. So I'll talk a little bit more about the two models later, but basically there's two user gestures for taking something offline. There's the right-click install, which we basically add to every context menu. So every Silverlight app now has this option, and it's disabled if you don't have the right manifest stuff, and we'll talk about the manifest stuff later on. And the other option is you can create a button, which is what the KEXP demo did. You click that, and then that can trigger the same thing as clicking this. So now you get this UI. So this UI is provided by the platform. Basically, it says, where do you want your shortcuts? You can do in desktop start menu, one or both. There's actually a cute bug in the beta. What happens if you click OK and you check none of those? So we have to fix that before we ship. But basically, in this dialog here, you can customize. Your app can provide an icon. This is the default icon that ships to the platform. You can provide icons in your manifest. And you can provide a bunch of different sizes. So you can provide a big one here. You can provide a smaller one for this taskbar, even smaller one for your title bar. So when you click this, we launch the application in the out-of-browser host that ships as part of Silverlight. And now the app is running out of the browser. So if we close both of these down now, you can see that on the desktop, we now have a shortcut to this to launch it, which will launch it. You also have integration with search. So you can find that right there. There's your slide app, and you can launch that. So that's pretty cool. And the uninstall experience, which they didn't show this morning at the keynote, but Joe showed in his talk earlier, his overview talk, is a right-click, remove this application. So right now, there's no add or remove programs entries for this. We're going to kind of evaluate feedback on what people feel. We kind of felt add or remove programs is a little heavyweight and a little hard to get to. So this gesture is nice because it's right with the application. So you launch the app, you always know where to do it, and it's really quick to find it. And so when you click remove this application and asks you if you want to remove it, you click yes. It closes down your app and removes all the shortcuts from your machine. So that's a quick walk through the UX. Go full screen again here. So the general philosophy that we had in going through in creating this feature in Silverlight, again, going back to kind of two facets of the philosophy. The first one is really just keep it simple. So just a quick show of hands, who's familiar with click once in the .NET framework? Wow, a lot of hands. This is, in many ways, kind of the next of click once, not really in a sharing technology, but in some of the user experiences. A lot of this is really a tuned version of the UX and the defaults around click once, as far as when you launch the app, when you prompt, or when you show updates, what kind of UI you show for updates is really a refinement on that. But basically, the idea is to have really simple, easy-to-use defaults. And also, again, keeping it simple, only one download on the machine is required. Once you have Silverlight on the machine, that's all you'll need to run this stuff. You don't need to have any other installation experiences, anything like that. So the other key tenet of this model is to keep it like the web. Going back to what I talked about earlier, the web deployment model is really, really compelling. Kevin McIntyre from Netflix talked about that this morning, basically saying that installations are evil. I wouldn't quite go that far. They're certainly a pain. But what they do is they increase friction for your customers, right? Your customers don't want to download something extra. They see a bunch of extra prompts. It's really, like the Netflix folks saw, it's a drop-off in what how many customers will install your app. So the idea is to provide the most friction-free experience possible so that you don't have a drop-off. And a key part of that is only having one installation. The other part is having not scary security prompts. So we basically say, because there's nothing extra this app can do to harm your machine, we don't need to show a security prompt. We can just say, hey, where do you want your shortcuts? And the other tenet of that is that we found that most applications actually can work just fine within the sandbox. So we haven't, obviously there's a lot of other things we're trying to do to extend the sandbox as we move forward in future versions of Silverlight. But even with what we have in Silverlight 3, there's a lot you can do just living within the sandbox today. There's actually quite a bit you can do. One other kind of footnote about like the webness, you've got kind of emerging standards in HTML5 that does have some offline support. There's kind of two interesting caveats there, especially if that question comes up, why isn't Silverlight using HTML5 and that type of thing. First off, HTML5 isn't super prescriptive about the user experience around offline. It really just more has tags that you can put in HTML around offline. And also, there's really no browsers that support it yet. So because we have to support, Silverlight has to work the same in all the different browsers it runs in, we want to make sure that we have a model that essentially goes with, is consistent across different browsers. And if a out-of-the-browser model emerges or offline HTML model emerges that's really compelling and that kind of wins, we'll definitely morph ours or even just use the browser version once that becomes ubiquitous. But for the time being, we're kind of pushing the envelope here a little bit, and we need to basically make that work consistently across browsers. So this should be mostly just a review, but just to kind of recap some of the stuff we've talked about earlier and you saw earlier in the keynote. There's really two gestures for going offline. There's a user or application provided experience where basically you can provide any sort of visual in Silverlight and call a method on the application object to take it offline. That has to be done by a user-initiated action, so a keyboard click or a mouse press or a keyboard click. The reason that is you don't want an ad to be able to launch itself offline automatically. I mean, that would be terribly annoying just to pop that dialog all the time. So we want to make sure it's user-initiated. And then, of course, there's the right-click experience, which you saw. And both those models work on both Windows and Mac. This really enables the kind of two application models we talked about, the run before install and the click to install. So you saw both of those. I'll show you essentially both of those later on in demos. And again, with the network connectivity APIs we've got in Silverlight 3, you now have the ability to write your traditional web app, your always connected type application. Then you can do your, sorry about that, an always disconnected application, which is really an offline, not really working with live data or web services. And you can kind of do the occasionally connected app, which a lot of people feel is the sweet spot. And I'll show you how to do some of that stuff and use the networking APIs a little bit later on. So let's talk about the types of things you can do to basically enable your app to be available offline, and some things you can do on the application once your app is kind of running offline or available. So the key thing, the thing that Silverlight looks for in an application to know whether or not it's available for offline is in the manifest. The manifest is a loose XML file that's inside your zap. So you guys are probably all familiar with this, but a zap is just a zip file. Rename it to zip. You can open up and see what's in it. There'll be a manifest.xml file. If you look in there, in Silverlight 3, there's a new thing you can put in there called an application identity, and that's what essentially turns on offline support. That lets you set the name, the title, and the description of the application. So the name is what shows up in the start menu or the shortcut. The title is what shows up in the title bar, and the description is what shows up on if you hover over the shortcut in Windows and in the help about on the Mac for your application. And you can also set icons, which is something, again, you can do in the manifest file. And then on the application object itself, you have the detach method, which is the thing that initiates offline. We'll show a demo of that. Actually, we'll show demos of all this stuff in a second. You have execution state, which tells the developer if the app is basically, has it been enabled for offline use, or is it basically only a browser-based app? And it also has information about when updates are available and when the state of your app, whether it's being transitioned from in the browser to out of the browser, information about that and some states around that. And then there's a state change property, which tells you when those things change. And finally, there's this running offline property, which that's the thing you check to know whether or not your app is actually running inside the browser or in our out-of-browser host. So I'll show you I'll tie this stuff together in kind of a mini application. You can see how it goes. So let's start with a demo of that. So the first thing we'll do is create a new project in Visual Studio. This right here is my pitch for Joe to buy me a new machine. A little slow. So, like all good apps, we'll start with a button. And we'll just make it, we'll just try and center it in the screen, so the grid's going to always center it. Click. Throw in a click handler. Then we'll change our default size to take up the whole screen. And then we'll go and add a little message box here. All right. So now to enable this offline, we'll go to the Solution Explorer, and we'll drill into the properties. And there's this app manifest XML here. So this is what basically gets compiled into your Zap. Now, you're probably saying, boy, that's going to be this is a cruddy way to enable this thing offline. In post the beta, the tools team is going to add to the properties UI here an ability, basically there'll be a new tab that talks about running out of the browser, and there'll be, you can basically turn this on from here. So we'll have much better tooling support for this. But for the time being in the beta, you've got to open up the manifest.xml file, and the template is nice because it gives you a default identity, and you just uncomment this. They should have double commented this one. Delete that, and so then basically that's your that has now told Silverlight that this thing is available to run offline. So if you look at what's in this thing, you've got your short name, which is again what shows up in your shortcut. You've got your title, which is what shows up in the title bar of your window, and you've got a blurb, which is essentially the description of your app. So we'll leave this to the default because I don't think you guys want to see me go crazy with some pros. So now when we run this, you'll see that it's a wonderful application inside the browser. And we can also now are enabled to run outside of the browser. Click this. And there you go. It's running outside of the browser. That's right. It's that easy. And again, you can go find this right there and search. So it's pretty nice. And of course, you can uninstall it. We'll be doing a lot of uninstalling, so it's actually kind of handy to have that right there. So the next thing you can do is you can change the icon that shows up for your application. So this will control your shortcut icon, your title bar icon, as well as the icon that shows up in the dialog that asks you where you want your shortcuts. So I've got a nice pencil image here. This is the one that we use for all our sample apps, so I'll just reuse this one. And so that's just a PNG. You can have different sizes. I'm just going to add one and just add the biggest size. And you'll notice that had transparency. And so then what we'll do here is we'll add in some code to the application icon. So in the identity, you can set the icon. And you can have a collection of these icons of different sizes of the typical ones you'd expect, the 16, 32, 64. I'm just going to put the one big one in there. And we have to go back to the Solution Explorer and make this content, not that. All right. So content, this basically puts it inside the Zap, not inside of a DLL, not as a resource, and loose inside of the Zap package. So now when we run this, and we install it, you'll see that we have the pencil here. So you'll notice that we didn't get the alpha here. That's a bug. It'll get fixed. But when we run this, you'll see that we do respect the alpha up here, as well as the alpha in the start menu. You can also pin this here to the taskbar. And so you'll see that we also show the alpha there, which is kind of nice. Let's unpin this and install this guy. So the next step is, let's say I want that button to, instead of being a click button, let's say I want that to be my installation experience. So to start off, we'll change our button content to say install. And instead of showing a message box, what we'll do is we'll call the detach property. Application.current.detach, sorry, it's a method, not a property. And what that does is essentially the same thing as the user clicking on the context menu. So the thing that's in the beta right now, if you call this thing twice, it throws an exception. So we don't want that to happen. So we'll put a little fcheck here, and we'll check to see if it actually is running, if it's already available offline. So to do that, you check the execution state property. And the enum here, there's a bunch of different options. The one we're interested in is detached. Sorry, actually running online. So we basically want to say if it's not detached yet, we want to call detach. So we'll see if it's running online, then we'll call detach. And that will basically transition to the detached state. So now let's run this again. Now when you click this, it basically triggers the detach, the same thing as right-clicking. And there you go. And now if notice that we're available offline, if we click it again, it just doesn't do anything because we're basically in the detached state, not the running online state. So now let's go and try and make the KEXP user experience where you have a button in the browser and your out-of-browser app looks like an application. So I'm not going to take the time to build a UI. I took a screenshot of Paint. Windows 7 Paint's a little sexier than regular Paint. And we'll put that in here. And now we'll add some code to check that in your constructor, if you're basically running outside of the browser, we'll basically create that image and show that instead of the button. So again, we'll check application.current dot running offline. So basically this says your application is running outside of the browser. And now we'll create an image. So I think we ended up adding Paint 2. Come on. There we go. Make sure I added the right one, Paint 2. Okay. So now when we run this guy, so we click the install button. Let's uninstall it first. And when we install this, you'll now see that we have application UI, and in the browser, you're seeing essentially an install button. So you can use that property to basically toggle your UI if you want to have the in-browser click to install me experience. So finally, let's show a little bit more about how the states transition between in-browser and out-of-browser. So what we'll do is we'll attach the execution state changed event handler. What just happened there? No higher. Oh, dude, come on. There we go. Thanks, guys. Group coding. It's therapeutic. All right. So what we're going to do here is basically create a little prefix that we're going to throw on to each event. And so we're going to show basically if we're running outside of the browser, we'll put up out of browser, colon, and if we're running inside of the browser, we'll do in-browser colon. So you can see basically which application is showing the message box. This actually does bring up a key interesting thing about this is that you basically have two instances of the exact same app running at the same time, so it can create a little bit of some debugging headaches. So I'll show you some tricks later on about how to make that a little easier to debug what's happening. So first things first, we'll show install, and you'll see that you actually do in-browser. If the in-browser is available when you uninstall, that thing will get a notification that says that basically triggers its execution state back to the original one. Now if you install, so first off, in the browser you see you get detaching, which is basically saying I'm in the process of detaching, and then you transition to the detached state. Now if we go back to the out-of-browser one that popped up, you'll notice that no message box has happened. So this app essentially doesn't get any state changed events when it starts. It is already running in the attached state as soon as it starts. So really your only opportunity to run code here is to check the running offline property to make sure that it's running outside of the browser. If you want this specific app, the out of browser one, to run code, you need to check the running offline property. So that's kind of a key thing to do. So again, we'll uninstall this. And see that prompt. All right, now we'll remove this stuff because it's going to be frustrating to see a bunch of message boxes. Okay, let's dive back into the slides. So again, as I kind of showed with the code and what was happening, essentially your in-browser application starts off its execution state is running online. When either the detach method is called or the user right-clicks and opts to go out of the browser, you go to the detaching state. At that point, the out-of-browser app spins up, and it's automatically in the detached state, and it basically says running offline equals true. And then the in-browser one transitions to detached, and it says running offline equals false, and that's how you basically determine between the two different instances. Let's see, where were we? All right, so let's talk about updates. Going back to what we talked about before, the key tenet we wanted for this is to keep it very, very similar to the web. So the idea is to optimize these apps for instant on. So even if we don't want to stop the app running, if there's an update available and stop for checking, we basically want to run the app right away. So the app launches, as soon as it launches, the runtime itself checks for an update automatically. It will download the update, and it will prompt the user, or will prompt the developer with an event, which they can choose to ignore. And if nothing happens, if the developer does nothing with that event, the next time the user runs the app, you'll get the new version. So basically, it's as close to the web model as we could get it with still having an instant-on experience and not having to ping the server for updates every time, or taking time for the network to time out if you're not online. And then you do get this event. If you're a developer, you might want to show some UI that says, hey, there's an update downloaded, my data model has changed, you can't do anything with this app because I can't talk to the server anymore, and gray out all your UI, or ask the user to close it down and run it again. You can just note it for yourself that maybe next time the app runs, you might want to show some UI to the user when the update is actually applied to say, hey, here's a new version of the app, check out the new UI. We've heard some feedback from users that larger changes in application, web apps and not web apps, if they change the UI greatly, people like to be informed that, like, hey, this is new and there's a reason for it. So it's kind of a general, goodness and tip to let users know if you're going to provide a major UI update or something that's going to significant new functionality, to let users know the updates happened automatically. So let's try and demo this. I've been having some problems demoing updates lately. There's kind of a little bit of flakiness in the beta around updates from localhost, which is basically I'm running Cassini here in Visual Studio. So if you're running from an actual web server, it runs fine, but the localhost version is a little flaky. So we'll see if this works. May or may not. So first off, the thing to note is the event that happens when an update is downloaded is execution state changed. So basically, your code here is an execution state changed. You check to see if detached updates are available. So you hit this state once you have a download and it's been downloaded. So it's not necessarily something that's available. It's available and ready to go for the next time you run the app. So to simulate an update, we will go and change our paint image. So let's go change it to an empty paint image. So delete this one. Go drag in the first one. So now by building, we've basically propped that up to the server. And you know what? I uninstalled it. Oh. I guess we're going to do 2 updates here. All right, so there's our original version. Now let's do an update. Now we'll go back to our second image. All right, so assuming the update stuff works, which we'll cross our fingers here, when we run the app, we should see this message box telling us there's an update, and the next time we run it, we should see the new image. It's not looking good. Okay. No updates for you. We just got soup Nazi'd. Is Cassini running? That's a great question. Yes, it is. So yeah, there's something going on there. again, if you were to push this to a real web server, it would work fine. We test this in-house quite frequently, but from the development perspective, it's a little frustrating. In the beta, it's just a bug that we'll fix. So moving on. So let's talk about network availability. Before we even jump into network availability, as far as networking goes, one key thing to understand is that the in-browser app and the out-of-browser app, they're the exact same ZAP, the exact same application, and from both an ISO store perspective and a networking perspective, we treat them as the same thing, and we also remember where your site of origin was for your in-browser app, so the out-of-browser app still thinks that's its site of origin. So even if you have network connectivity, you still are limited to the site of origin, and all your site of origin will still be wherever your original domain was. So if you came from foo.com, even if you're running outside of the browser, network request to foo.com is still site of origin. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. As far as network availability goes, we've added a new event, as Scott mentioned, and a new property, which basically says, it should be a property section event. There's some .NET compat things there. But basically, this lets you know whether or not you have a valid IP address. So as you guys are probably aware, a valid IP address doesn't necessarily mean you can get to the internet. There's a few things about that let's say you're at home, you're connected to your router, you still have a connection to your router, and your cable modem goes down. You think you have a valid IP address, you're fine internally, but you can't get out to the network. Also, there's a case where, let's say you're in Starbucks, if you make a request, you still, basically are getting back valid requests. You're getting, 401s back, but you're getting back the Starbucks login page, right? So even though you think you have an IP address, your requests are coming back with data, with not error return codes, you actually aren't connected to the web. So there's some pretty subtle problems. For a drill down into this, there's a mini session on Friday that Peter Smith from the networking team on Silverlight is going to give that really drills down to this problem and how to use these APIs a little more, gives you some more tips and tricks on using these APIs. I'm going to show a quick sample that does kind of a quick recommended best practices, but the recommended best practice is basically when your IP address changes, when this event fires, check to see if you have a valid IP address, check that property, and if you do, ping a known web server that you own and check the response back. So basically, check for a text file, an XML file, whatever, and verify that what you got back is indeed what you expect and not the Starbucks login page. So let's show a quick demo of that. So first things first is we will listen to the event. Actually, first let's throw in some UI. So let's put some UI in our app to show whether or not we're connected. So we're going to use everyone's favorite rectangle. Basically, we're going to fill this with green if you're connected, and we're going to make it red if you're disconnected. So we're going back to code. We'll hook the event here. So the network change object is what has this event on it. And essentially, you hook up to the network address changed, and you give it a delegate. So I'll go ahead and give it a delegate. Now what we're doing here is this is the property to check, the get network available. So this basically says whether or not Silverlight thinks you have a valid IP address. So in the case where we do have a valid IP address, we're going to spin up a web client, and we're going to download this ping.txt file, which I'm going to now add. So basically put this up on the web server. And ping.txt just says this is a test. And so we'll basically fire off that download. And if we don't have an IP address, we're just going to, at this point we know we're not online, we'll basically just set the fill of that rectangle to be red. So now when we get back from the web client, we're basically going to check our result, because we just did a network request for the string. We got back the string. If it matches, we're still online, we're good to go. If not, it's basically, we're going to make that thing red and go offline. So now run the app. You'll notice that we're online. So I'm going to switch off my wireless here, and it pops red right away. And to verify that we have no network connectivity there, and you put that back on, and then it pops green again. So basically, that's kind of your best practices for doing network connectivity. So there's a lot of, at the end of the day, there's a lot of really useful code in this app, even though it might not be the prettiest thing you've ever seen. So I will throw it up on my blog afterwards, so you guys can download that and kind of copy and paste for some patterns and practices. So the other thing about an app that's running on your machine is you're going to want to save data locally. So when you are disconnected, you're going to want to interact with the file system in a couple different ways that Silverlight 3 lets you interact with the file system. The first way is kind of an extension of what we had in Silverlight 2, which is ISOstore. So when I said that the sandbox isn't changed from Silverlight or from in the browser to out of the browser, I lied a little bit. It's just a white lie. Basically, when your app runs outside of the browser, we increase your isolated storage quota automatically from 1 meg to 25 megs. So that's a key difference. It's 25 times more storage. Silverlight 3 now with 25 times more storage. And you can still use the isolated storage APIs to query how much storage you have left and also request additional space with the same prompt that we had in Silverlight 2. On the flip side, if you want to save to somewhere else on the system, somewhere that, let's say, is maybe indexable by search, which isolated storage isn't, you can use the open and save file dialogues to prompt the user to interact. That's basically what my slideshow application does, is you can save those things locally. I'll show you a demo of that in a second. I'll also show you a demo of some isolated storage. So let's start with the isolated storage. So the key thing here is not necessarily using isolated storage, it's when you use isolated storage. So the pattern I've kind of found that's worked pretty well for me is when your app is actually running out of the browser, when it's launched out of the browser, do your checks there for data and download the data if you don't have it. Because at that point, you're typically have been at least, we're just online, right? Because your app was just taken offline. And that it's a little easier of a mental model to understand what's happening where, because you basically do have two instances of the same application running at once. So what we'll do is we'll write this method called load data. And what load data will do is check isolated storage if the data I want is present, and if not, it will go download it and save it into isolated storage. So let's add a method here. So what does load data do? So basically, we create an isolated storage file, again, using the same code you could do in Silverlight 2, and we're checking for this data.xaml file. And if it's not there, we're going to go download it. So let's go add data.xaml to our web server. And data.xaml is just a button. So it's a simple XAML file that we're just going to download and load and add to the scene if it's present. So again, we're going to check to see if this file exists in isolated storage. If not, we're going to fire off a web client request for it. And if it does, we're just going to basically process the local version. So here's our response from the web client. So again, when we get back from the response, we spin up another isolated storage file, and we save. Come on, there you go. And so once we're done saving it to isolated storage, we'll use XAML reader.load, and we'll basically add it to our canvas. Now, in the case where it's already present, we'll load it locally, which again, spinning up isolated storage and creating a reader from it, and then adding that using create from XAML to the tree. So first of all, we'll uninstall, because we're going to do this. We're going to do this basically when the app launches offline. Let's take it offline. So at this point, we're going to begin the download. Once we get it back, we process that, and we load it inside the application. Now, if you go to Silverlight configuration, you'll see that, let's see, 52493. So you'll note that basically by doing that, we've now created an isolated storage. And you can also see that your quotas are automatically increased to 25 megabytes here. Because the file I picked was so small, it's not actually showing up here, but it is indeed an isolated storage. These two here are instances of my little slideshow app here that save. There's an image library of background images. I save that stuff locally. And so you can see that I'm basically saving that stuff there. It's also interesting to surf this and see who else puts stuff on your machine. Watch out for those Netflix guys. Okay, so let's show off the open and save file dialogues here. So save file dialog lets you basically save anywhere on the machine. Joe showed this earlier. But basically what it does is it prompts the user for a file name, and then it basically gives the developer back a stream. So you've kind of protected the user's file system by not letting the developer know where they've chosen, but it lets you save something. So let's save a copy of this slideshow to the desktop. So now we save this thing locally, and you'll see that we have our basic slideshow file that we just saved. And you can, again, use the open file dialog to open that up and interact with the file system. So there's the disadvantages of that are you have to prompt. The advantages are that you can save stuff anywhere, and you can save stuff to places that are searchable. So now this basically will be indexed by Windows Search or Spotlight on the Mac. Let's see, where were we? Okay, so what I'm going to do now is walk through on the file system where things go and what happens when you bring something out of browser and where things are stored, because it is a kind of interesting thing to see. So first things first, if you look at one of these shortcuts, so here's our out-of-browser application. Let's see what the shortcut looks like. So basically what this thing links to is something in the Silverlight bin. It links to slauncher.exe. So this is a little exe host file that we install with the Silverlight runtime. And what Silverlight slauncher.exe is basically a Win32 or OS X app that just hosts either IE or WebKit in kind of full screen, and we basically have a default HTML page that we load your app into. So we basically simulate the browser, but you really aren't in the browser. And then we pass it a command line argument that points to basically an index into our local table of where we save these applications. So where are the apps themselves actually stored? So if you drill down into your username, you look at app data and local low. So local low is the reduced privileges section of the file system. In Microsoft, we've got this new offline folder here, and inside of it we basically store each one of these apps. So you can see this is where your application is, its icon, and various pieces of information that we use about the system. So this is where we store the fact that this thing came from localhost, and that's how we push through back again to the networking APIs that, yes, your site of origin is still localhost. And then as far as your data storage, you've got isolated storage. You guys are going to love this, by the way. So this stuff is designed to be not spoofable, and in no way that you can do a path discovery attack. This is kind of copied from the full .NET framework, so keep watching because this is extraordinarily obtuse. So very clearly, this stuff is not. It kind of takes the IE cache to 11, if you will, as far as not discoverability. But the goal here is, again, to have data that's for your application, but it's definitely not for users to consume directly. And if you need it for users to consume stuff directly, you should use the open or save file dialog. The story on the Mac is actually a little bit simpler. So the Mac has this concept of a bundle, and when we, in the offline model on the Mac, you basically take your Zap and put it inside of a bundle, and you can put it wherever you want on your operating system. That's kind of instead of putting on the desktop or start menu, you can basically just drag the bundle anywhere you want on the system. And then you can just double-click that. So everything is stored inside that bundle on the Mac. It's actually pretty clean. And so your deinstallation model on the Mac is even easier. You just delete the bundle. So it's a pretty nice model there. So now we'll talk a little bit about debugging. Hopefully, you guys understand that the difference is now the execution states and the running offline property enough of what happens between the two apps to kind of figure out where a bug might be in either of those processes. However, one of the key things to note for your application that's running out of the browser is that the HTML DOM bridge is not available. So when the HTML DOM bridge is not available, the question is, what happens with your exceptions? Because if you look at the default template here, an unhandled exception, what do? You pass it right out to the DOM bridge. So that clearly is not going to work. So let's just highlight how that's not going to work with a nice little sample. So now what we'll do when we're running offline, after this, I'm sure you guys write code like this all the time. So we'll throw an exception when you're running out of the browser. Install the new one. So something went wrong. The app didn't load. What went wrong? No one knows. Right? It's basically impossible to debug with the default. So one quick and easy fix for that is to go through and, instead of passing it to the DOM, show a message box. So exception and show the message. You could also write a more complicated version of this that would have a bunch more detail and kind of break it down, but we'll just write a really simple one here. So now when you do this and you install again, install the new one, you'll see that you get a little bit, you can actually have a chance to catch your exception and do some information around that. The other thing that you might want to do from a debugging perspective is actually debug the instance that's running out of the browser. So right now, the in-browser one is what's attached to VS when you hit F5. The out-of-browser one kind of spins up and runs. Post-beta, we're going to have an option in the tools that will let you pick which one you want to launch in, so you can simulate running out-of-browser or in-browser. For the time being, you have to basically use VS as attached. So we'll uncomment our exception, because that's not going to help anyone. And we'll run our app again. Oops. I uncommented the message box and uncommented the exception. One more time. So there we go. So now let's attach to this. So close down that. We use the attach to process dialog in VS, and we'll go look for SL Launcher because we know that's what's running. And so here is our application. We'll attach to this. Now we can go through and we can set breakpoints here. So let's do our network address change because we know that one's easy to trigger. So go there. Now we're attached to our app, and let's switch my network off again. And there you go. So that's how you debug into the out-of-browser versions. And again, post-beta, we're going to make that a lot easier, so the tool will let you do that automatically. So I mentioned the DOM bridge access. There's a few other differences, pretty critical differences for in the browser, out of the browser. One of the nice things is that the browser is no longer sucking up kind of getting the first shot at all the keystrokes, so you can handle a lot more different key combinations, control plus keys, but especially the function keys. So, one nice thing is I'm using F5 to launch the slideshow in my slideshow app when it's out of browser, but in browser I have to generate some other wonky keyboard combination. I did mention the DOM bridge access, and that's kind of a pain because of some of the things that you typically would use the DOM bridge for, workarounds that things aren't in Silverlight today, things like mouse wheel support or access to XML HTTP for a full REST stack. So those are actually two instances of things that we know are very painful, and we're trying to post Silverlight 3 beta, but before we RTW, trying to address both of those via some other mechanisms so that you can have basically a HTTP REST stack that has more than just get and post and allows you to do some of the things you would do with XML HTTP in the DOM bridge, as well as add mouse wheel events natively to Silverlight so that you can do that without having to rely on the DOM bridge. The other thing that it's a current limitation, and as Joe said a bunch of times today, it's one of those things that we know is really important and we're working actively on fixing, is there's really no HTML interop story right now. So there's many, many, many scenarios where people rely on HTML plus Silverlight for their application experience. I mean, ad hosting is a super obvious one. Playing back, stuff from an RSS feed is kind of a simpler version, but there's a lot of things where you want to use HTML either for hosting existing content like ads or playing or basically loading things like HTML mail or something else there. So that's something that we're working on actively. It won't be in Silverlight 3, but we know it's very painful, and we know we need to address it as soon as we can and get that in the market. So let's talk about best practices for how to build your app to support running out of the browser. I mentioned a few of these earlier, but we'll kind of reiterate them all here. So the first thing, we talked about networking, and I showed kind of saving things to isolated storage. It's really easiest if you check to see if you're running out of the browser, and it's your first time that you're running out of the browser, and you can go do your networking there. So it's much cleaner mentally to know how things are going. The other thing I found is that as far as HTTP web requests go, you're much better off serializing them than sending off a dozen. So let's say you've got like 20 or 30 pieces of data you want to save. You don't want to fire off 20 or 30 HTTP web requests at the same time, because then you've just created 20 or 30 threads from the thread pool, and you're going to hit the limitations about how many different things you can have back to, or connections you can have back to your browser, or back to your server. We still have the same limitation as that, where you can basically have 2 at a time. So you're much better off just basically serializing those, creating a big loop or a collection of all the places you want to download, and then just looping over those. And once you get one, fire off the next request. The other thing is make sure and keep your code in your Zap. The Silverlight model does the kind of servicing and update model for you automatically by checking for updates based on HTTP expiration. There are some cases like the extension stuff that Scott talked about. It is the new Silverlight 3 feature, as well as you can in SL2 you could download DLLs and use load component to kind of split your app up, which is really great for a connected app. For a disconnected app, it kind of puts all that work for managing with that offline into your hands. So it's much easier for an offline app to put everything together in your Zap. You can put assets outside, but again, it's kind of up to you to manage versioning those and dealing with making sure those are present. Again, when you're talking about the data model and updates, you should really use that event to let your users know if something has changed so fundamentally with your app that it can't run anymore, because we basically need one flip, one run before the update is run. You should really ask your users to require a restart. So just in that event, when you have an update, basically just prompt the users and give them a little message box and say, hey, you need to shut down. And if they don't shut the app down, just basically turn off all your UI. Put a big rectangle over it that's hit test visible true, and they can't even interact with anything. Also, make sure and let users know if a major update does occur so that they know to expect differences. It's kind of jarring for most folks to see a big change without any sort of update. So, quick plug, my blog has a bunch of these samples. It has the slideshow app and links to get all the SL3 stuff if you don't know, if you haven't installed that on your machine. And if you guys have questions, come on up and we'll get them answered.
How you doing?
Hey.
So I have a question about if I've got an application that uses an ActiveX control so that it can access the file system and actually execute an application rather than just pulling up a file like you have with ISOstore, does Silverlight 3 enable you to access the file system in the same way so that you don't need the ActiveX control? So in other words, not just accessing the file system, but executing an application on the file system.
So Silverlight 2 and Silverlight 3 are still all about being inside the sandbox. And so that means not being able to kick off random processes on the user's machine. So one thing you could do is if you have a way to install trusted code on the user's machine, you can use the local connection feature to basically spin up an instance of the Silverlight as an ActiveX control in your other native code and basically have a connection between them to talk. So you can, because local connection works in and out of the browser, and you can host Silverlight in other unmanaged applications because it's really just an ActiveX control, you can use that as a connection point to connect your not Silverlight app to an in-browser or out-of-browser Silverlight application. And so you could use that to trigger actions to happen that your trusted thing can do that your in-browser one can't.
So you would have to deploy that trusted application separately.
Yeah, assuming you have a way to get trusted code on the user's machine, you can do that.
Is click once one of those deployment methods for a trusted application?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
So how does all this work with Blend? Can you edit this stuff in Blend in the offline
Well, so
mode?
how does all this stuff work in Blend is a good question, and it works the same, is the answer, right? I mean, there's very little new here. We talked a lot about it, basically 5 or 6 new APIs, right? And then the manifest changes. So Blend, the XML file, you can edit the XML in Blend, and with the new code editor in Blend 3, you can write all that code. So the appearance of your application isn't really changed at all. And so the visual design stuff that they have doesn't really impact you much at all. So basically it disappears.
You had the 2 different views, right? The click to install and the click.
Yeah.
not
Yeah,
running offline.
that's a good point. There's no help for that right now, that's a interesting request. I'll hit up Peter for that. It's a good idea.
And can you cancel a download of an update?
So right now you can't cancel the download of an update. One of the things we're looking at doing post beta is we've heard a lot of feedback, and also the lawyers kind of got wind of this, and they need us to add a checkbox for users to opt out of application updates, but that's not going to be something developers will have access to. It's basically a user choice.
I saw that you were using PNGs for icons, custom icons, that kind of thing. Is there any way to make, if our application is going into a tray, some sort of dynamic icon, like you've got a social networking site and you have 5 new messages, that kind of thing, that they could see that in the tray?
Auto-updating the icon? There's not a way to do that.
Yeah, okay.
There's not a way to do that
So
in
it's
SL3. That's definitely something we've heard a lot of people say. I want some way to update the user, notify the user, and so basically the best idea I've heard someone suggest with what we have in SL3, and we know we need to make this better in future versions because it's such a common request. The best thing I've heard today is to basically do messagebox.show, because if your app is minimized, it'll flash.
Oh, okay.
So that's one option.
Couple of questions. Isolated storage allocation. If the user requests, if the application requests an increase of storage to, let's say, 1 gigabyte, is the memory allocated upfront, or is it allocated on demand?
It's on demand.
Okay.
So we don't blow a 10 gigabyte file into your ISO store. No, it basically says how much data you can write there.
Second question is, when you do save file dialog, does it need to be a user event triggered, or is it something that?
Yes. So open and save file dialog also, I guess I should have mentioned that, also can only be called to show on a user initiated action. So basically, it's got to be a button click or a key press to show those dialogues, or else it'll just basically do nothing.
Okay. One more question is that if I have an offline app and an online, they all refer to the same isolated storage, isn't it?
Yes. So both online and offline are the same ZAP, and they share the same isolated storage location. So that's another way that you can have the apps talk to each other in a more persistent manner. You can use local messaging to have them talk back and forth when they're live, but you can use isolated storage to send messages to them while they're asleep, essentially.
So how do they discover each other? Do I actually use isolated storage as a kind of like a
you could use isolated storage as one way. You could also use local messaging if they're both up to discover each other.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So I actually had a few questions. My first one's actually a follow-up. So if you have a detached application and you have like 10 megs in isolated storage and you uninstall it, what happens? Does it downgrade the space?
That's a great question. It does not.
Okay.
So right now, the current beta behavior, and we're going to kind of see what happens with feedback, is we just leave it at 25 megs.
Okay.
And the tricky part is, what would you, if you put it down to a meg, what 24 megs would you delete?
Exactly.
Right? It's not. That's a very hard problem to solve. So we're just going to try and punt on that for now, and hopefully that's okay.
Gotcha. So I was also wondering about drag and drop and file associations and command line arguments. Is there anything, because you have like a slideshow application, and can I drag files into that? Is there any sort of command line access? Or
there's not right now in Silverlight 3, but that's absolutely something we're thinking about, because again, it's very compelling. I mean, you also mentioned file association, which is something we don't allow, but people have asked for as well.
Mm-hmm. So there's no drag and drop experience?
No, not yet.
Okay. So I was just wondering, my last question was, what features that are OS, that are interacting with the OS, what features do you plan on including in the future? I can think of like the Mac and its menu bars and so forth, and jump lists in Windows 7.
So jump lists for sure. There's a lot of, just in general, there's a lot of, so there's things that are specific to offline, and then there's things that aren't specific to out of browser, and the things that aren't specific to out of browser. The things that are specific to out of browser are things like integration with one of the things that we're actually is not in this build of Silverlight, but we've already fixed is integration with Superbar. So right now everything shows up under SL launcher.exe because they're all SL launchers. So we've done some work to disambiguate them so they show up as separate things. The other thing is, like you mentioned, jump list is something we're looking at. Definitely better integration with search is something we're thinking about. Possibly some way to do notifications, which would be those are. It's kind of an OS feature. It's kind of odd because it's definitely specific. The UX of a notification is specific, right? Because on the Mac they come from the top, and Windows they come from the bottom. So some service like that. Some sort of persistent download service is something we're looking at. We might leverage like Windows bits for that, where you want to kick off a long running download, like a long media. If someone closes down your application, we still download it in the background. When it's done, we notify your app, or the next time your app runs, it gets notified. So there's things like that. HTML integration is obviously something we're going to have to figure out a story for.
One last quick question. What was the difference between the actual detaching and detached events? What can I do with one that I can't do with the other, and so forth? So you had like the execution state. There was, so when you run the event, there's a detaching and detached. Like why when I consume that API do I care?
So the state detaching basically is an opportunity for you to say, my app is being taken offline, right? So that's your one chance to do stuff there. And then the detached is basically, that state is, detaching is done. Okay. So
it seems like everything I could do in detaching, I could just check for, Yeah, can I prevent it or anything like that?
You're pretty spot on now. However, in the future, if it basically gives us a little headroom, if you want to split up your app in certain ways, or we ever add a way to componentize your app and you're starting to download more. Right now, the detaching process happens so quickly because it's an X copy. We've already got this app because we're running it, and we're copying it to the your local load data store. So right now it happens so quick, it's not terribly interesting, but it definitely would be an opportunity to put up progress UI.
Yeah, because I noticed interrupting the detaching event and throwing a message box, it's still detached.
Yeah, exactly. So that it's not cancelable, if you will.
Okay, that's all I had. Thanks.
Cool, thanks. Those are good questions.
Don't you see yourself catching yourself in a catch-22 if you have an installed app and then some corruption happens in the isolated storage, you load it up and it crashes on startup and you can no longer uninstall it? Because you got to have the app started to uninstall
I think your app needs to be resilient against the data it loads, right? I mean, you need to be able to catch exceptions in your data.
Well, I'm saying that, but from a user standpoint, what if a user installs an application and misbehaves, some misconfiguration, and they don't have an ability to uninstall it? So I would think it's better to have that maybe as a control panel tab in Silverlight rather than the application itself. Because
the ISO store thing?
No, the ability to uninstall, because the only ability to uninstall is within the application to get it started. What if you can't get it started?
I see what you're saying. So to uninstall, I get where you're going at too. No, that's a great point. Again, the model we have now, where we think it's a pretty good model, but we're putting it out there for feedback for the first time today. So we expect we'll get a lot of feedback from different folks. I mean, that's one thing we've considered. We've also considered add and remove programs entries. We're going to basically play it by ear and see what happens, and see how many people get themselves stuck in that state, and see how tough that is. And if it's something that we get a lot of feedback on, we'll make changes.
Right, it may be an option to remove the isolated storage during uninstall.
Yeah, you can. The user can manage isolated storage themselves.
Right.
So, but again, if your app is going to throw an exception every time it looks for isolated storage and doesn't find what it needs, well, it's not a very well-written app. But you're right. They still can't get rid of it.
I'm not saying more as a developer standpoint that I would do this. I'm just saying from a user standpoint who's using the
control. Yeah, no,
right?
that's actually a really good point. Is that that could be potentially really annoying.
Thanks.
Just leading on from that, as an idea of another way to remove things, the Internet Explorer icon on the desktop, if you right-click on it, has a remove from desktop in the context menu. Maybe that's another way of doing it on the apps, on their icons.
That's definitely something we've considered, and right now it's one of those things we might still be able to squeeze in for Silverlight 3, maybe not. But to use the $1 million man phrase, we have the technology to solve that today. We just need to figure out if we can land it from a quality perspective. So that's definitely a great idea.
First question. In the demo this morning, when they launched the Radio Player app, it maintained his user profile state. It had Hello Adam at the top. Does that mean there's access to cookies from the originating site from within the detached app?
So your network requests still go through the browser stack and still are from the same set of origins. So from that perspective, yes.
But
See-
does it have the cookie state with, say, my user ID? And if it does, how does that work if between multiple
It
browsers?
depends on how the cookie state is stored, right? If it's tied for the user, it'll be there, right? But if it's not, if it's something that is kind of ephemeral to the actual instance, that timing of the session, it could fail. So you could set up your app so it would work, basically, your web
Okay,
app
so if
on the website.
If I'm signed in Internet Explorer, I have a cookie, I detach my app, I'll still have access to that cookie. What happens if the user then goes to Safari and signs in as a different user, and then you launch the detached app? So across two different browsers, the same detached app, what context do I then end up with as a cookie?
So the context you end up with is basically IE on Windows and Safari on the Mac, because we're using the WebKit instance on the Mac and Shadok View, the browser control on Windows. So the test would be if you can sign in on IE and Windows and hit Control-N to get a new window, and you're signed in on that one too, it'll probably work in the out-of-browser host.
But if I'm
Does that make sense?
If I'm signed in in Firefox and I detach the app, I won't get the
No,
cookie state across.
they won't. Those
Okay.
won't percolate through.
With the network access, when you say it requires an IP that's not looped back, does that require a gateway to be set or not?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to, but you should go talk to Peter on his session on Friday.
Single instance applications, like a lot of social networking apps and whatnot, or even a Netflix app, you only want a single instance. Is there a way of nominating, only give me one?
There's not a perfect solution right now, but one of the things we've talked about internally, actually, as an idea for a demo for this talk was to do that. And the idea was to use local connection to look for other buddies and basically try and shut them down. The thing where it falls over in SL3 is that we don't have a shutdown method,
no
right?
close method.
So the best thing you can do is again, give a message box and gray out the UI. But that's as close as you can get for single instance.
On the next one. On the install button on the web page, if I go to, say, the radio website and it knows that it's already installed on the local machine, is there a way that I can swap that install button for an open button? Would that be calling to tap the second time where the bug is?
Joe and I are laughing because we really want to do that, and we're trying to figure out if we can squeeze it in or not. But it's definitely one of those things that is right on the cut line for SL3. So we know how to do it. We know we want to do it. It's just a matter of if we have time to do it in the SL3 schedule.
And last question for now.
But yeah, it's dead obvious that you want to do that.
Yeah. Last question for now. If you're talking about embedding all of your stuff in your Zap so that's all offline, don't do dynamic load component. That all makes sense. But it means that you could potentially end up with a fairly large Zap, which is fine on install. But on the homepage of a radio website, you've then got that entire footprint just for the install button. Is there a plan for a way that the install button can trigger the install of a different Zap location?
There's definitely, that kind of goes back to having the detaching to detached state be a little more meaningful in the future, is having a way to basically specify these cache assemblies like we have today, or other application parts that are Silverlight will recognize them on install essentially, that there's something extra and bring those down as well. But for the time being, we don't have support for that. So you can do it yourself, but again, it's a little more heavy lifting yourself because you now have to manage versioning those, right? Your mains app will get versioned by the runtime, but the rest of your app you have to deal with,
Right.
saving
So
it to new
I'm more
versions
thinking
to the
just having
store.
two Zaps. One is only the install button and nothing else, and that's your web property, and then it being able to, instead of calling
Yeah.
detach and having a parameter.
Yeah,
it
I mean,
passes
there's
in.
a couple different ways to solve it, and it's definitely something we thought about. But again, there's no way to do that in this version.
Cool.
Cool. Thanks a lot. You guys all have really good ideas.
Hi. Do you expect to support the Silverlight out of browser on Windows Mobile? What are your plans about the Windows Mobile?
That's a great
And
question.
And Silverlight.
I'm not going to comment too much on planning and scheduling for Windows Mobile, but I think that app model makes more sense than any other app model for a device. So if any, I guess when any version of Silverlight shows up on a Windows Mobile device, that will very likely be the primary app model, if not the only one.
So you're talking with the people with Windows Mobile.
Oh yes,
Okay.
our team works with them a lot.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
He took my question. No, I was going to ask that, but the other question was, as the out-of-browser experience gets richer, I'm guessing like as further iterations go on.
You guys, I know where you're going with this.
How much do you see this cannibalizing like WPF development?
I knew there's always one.
'Cause
There's always one of them in the group. So the thing that Silverlight's going to always the wall Silverlight's always going to hit is the semi-trust, is the sandbox wall, right? There's going to be things you just cannot do inside the browser, inside the sandbox that are going to be safe, right? Talking to a device, talking to a COM port. If some LOB apps might want to talk to a scanner, right? You're just not going to be able to have arbitrary hardware support inside a sandbox.
Okay.
There's probably some other things too, like talking anywhere on the file system. Like if we do some other file system, one of the ideas we had was to give you a restricted location that you can write to on a specific folder, like somewhere in my documents. But it's basically you get my documents, your app name. From down here you can party, but anywhere else.
Yeah.
If you need to go outside of that, if we do that in the future, you're again not going to be able to do that in the sandbox. So you'll probably have to use a full trust app for that, which is WPF is probably the richest way to build that right now.
So we can always just know that for Silverlight there will always be sandbox constraints. That will never change.
I'm not going to say never.
Yeah. So you're saying right now. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, thanks.
Speaking of the sandbox, is there any support for printing or for spawning a process from the Silverlight?
The printing question. In case Joe didn't mention it crisply enough this morning, it's killing us that we don't have printing. Yeah. It's super painful. We're trying to build it as fast as we possibly can and get it out as fast as we possibly can, but printing is just not something that we have the bandwidth to do in the next couple months.
Okay.
We're really absolutely understand how painful it is, and we're working to get in as quickly as possible. As far as talking to other stuff, again, if you have, going back to what we talked about with someone else who had a question, if you have the ability to get trusted code on the device, you can use the local messaging feature to interact with your trusted code and basically send data through that way. Okay. But again, that requires you to have some way to put like a little print widget on the user's machine that's full trust.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yep.
Regarding the support or the lack of support for the HTML bridge in offline mode, just trying to understand. I'm confused. I mean, it's running in a browser. Why?
It's running. So the problem is you're now running. So we do a bunch of work to make the Zap think it's running inside. It's running in the same context it's running before. However, we can't do that to the stock view instance we're running inside of. So it's actually a really big technical hurdle we basically have to turn off the DOM bridge, because otherwise you would be able to pop out to the DOM and create XML HTTP requests and other HTML elements and do things that basically would behave as if you're now running from the local machine, which in essence, that's what StockView thinks. It thinks you're running it from the local machine. So basically, it would be a world of security hurt if we open that up as it is today. So that's why we've turned off the DOM bridge. Does that make sense? It's not awesome, but that's why.
Well, I'm sure you have already heard this a lot, but basically, I was really excited up to that point, and I've heard that said, we cannot use it.
We'll get it soon. Thanks.
Related to offline, with isolated storage, now there's file access. What are the plans for something richer, like a database?
So right now, there's a lot of kind of creative things people have done to simulate databases in isolated storage. You may be familiar with some of the things you can, serialization plus link gets you pretty close. However, it's nowhere near as performant. You don't really get you have to do a lot of tricks if you want to get it to be, kind of incremental writes versus the whole thing every time. It's definitely something we want to do, likely in a future version, is adding a database, because as you start to get more complicated applications, especially data type applications like LOB things, it's, there's just going to be too much smaller bits of data to manage just on a file system level. So it's definitely something we're looking at.
So it's on the roadmap at some point?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Definitely on the roadmap. I think at this point it's trying to figure out which one to bring.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, I need to be able to control the Chrome of the actual window and the out-of-browser experience. Can you do that now, or are there any plans for adding that? So
in Silverlight 3 you can't, and again, the reason we made that decision is based on security, because it'd be really, really easy to spoof, something that looked like, let's say, your desktop, or some sort of, password dialog. So we basically, to mitigate those spoofs, we have to, keep the Chrome on for now. We're trying to figure out ways that we can. It's actually a surprisingly hard problem. We tackled this back in the WinForms days with the tool strips, because tool strip is basically the same thing. It's arbitrary widget you can draw on the screen, and if you can owner draw that in semi-stress, you can draw anything. And so we're trying to figure out a way that we can do that in a secure manner. And we have a couple ideas, but it's not a slam dunk. So it's definitely something we want to enable, and we've heard quite a few requests for it. We just need to figure out a way to do it without having your mom get pwned.
All right. Yep. One more question. Is it possible to spawn a new SL launcher process from an existing running Silverlight application?
Not today. That was basically a previous question where you want your install button to turn into a launch button if it's already installed, kind of a thing. There's no way to do that today.
Okay. A separate question is that the I guess that answered it.
Okay. Thanks.
So I actually had
First
a question.
answer was so bad.
So I actually had kind of a follow-up printing question because I saw this morning they had the writable bitmap. Would there be anything stopping you from writing to that and then having the user save it as a printable version so they could just print it outside your app?
So there's one thing stopping you in the beta, and the fact that writable bitmap you can't. So to do writable bitmap right, we have to keep track if you have a cross-domain image inside your scene and not let you do writable bitmap there. And so we haven't done that work in the beta yet. We're going to do it. Devs are working on it right now for Silverlight 3 final release. And the idea is that if you have a tainted image, we call it tainted image from another domain, you obviously don't want to get access to those pixels because let's say your app is coming from foo.com, you're inside of an intranet, and you can make a request to get an image because you'll happily load cross-domain images from someplace in your intranet, like let's say your PayStub site. And if foo.com could read those bits and send those back, they can see your paycheck, right? That's really bad.
Yeah.
So we need to do the tainting. Once we figure that out, you'll be able to render and read those bits back out. But today, you can do like a sample like Joe did, where you can write to the bitmap, or you can do kind of the rendered out scenes and do the kind of visual brush type things. But you can't, once you render it, you can't read those pixels again. So we'll fix that post-beta, but for the time being, you can't do that today. But once that's fixed in RTW, you'll absolutely be able to enable that scenario of writing to a file and saving it to a PNG or JPEG or bitmap. Yep. We're getting kicked off here. That's why the 24 alarm is going off. So these guys got to get queued up. We'll get more questions in the back afterwards. So sorry to cut you off there. Thanks a lot.